In our first few weeks together, we've spent a lot of time thinking about gender. Though there are many axes of identity and experience we examine in sociology, gender is definitely one of the most significant of them. Today we turn to another of those especially significant axes of identity and experience, race. We know that the US is an incredibly diverse society when it comes to race, but what does race look like in the US? Well, let's start by looking at race geographically. This map shows the distribution of minority populations in the US as of the most recent decennial census. We can see that though just over a third of the US population is non-white, different racial groups are not evenly distributed across this nation. People of color are more likely to live in the southern band of the United States, the southeast and southwest, as well as in major metropolitan areas. Now, as you might guess, even this is a bit simplistic, as different minority groups make up different proportions depending on where you look specifically. To get a little more nuance, we're going to focus on aggregate national trends, but just hold in mind that some of the numbers we'll see may vary depending on where in the country you look. Here's what the breakdown of racial groups in the US looks like, again coming from the most recent decennial census in 2010. You can see both population counts and percentage of the population. There are a few interesting things to note here. The vast majority of people identify as only one race. The largest racial group is whites, coming in at just under 3/4 of the population. African Americans make up just under 13% of the population. Pacific Islanders make up the smallest identified racial group at less than 1%, and many studies on race combine them with Asians because of their small numbers. You may also notice that the line for Hispanic and Latino is a different color and set somewhat apart from the rest of the table. If you're looking closely, you'll also see that the percent column totals to more than 100. What is going on here? The short answer is that the census treats the category Hispanic or Latino as fundamentally different from the other categories listed. In essence, you can be white and Hispanic, or black and Hispanic, or American Indian and Hispanic, and so forth. If so, you're counted in both of the appropriate lines. To understand why this is, as well as a few other interesting nuances about these numbers, let's turn to how the census asks about race and ethnicity. If you filled out the 2010 census form, you may have noticed a question asking about your race. This question contained 15 categories, including write-in options. But when they report the results, the census consolidates down into 5 basic categories: white, black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, which includes Indian, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Filipino, Vietnamese, and of course you can add others as well, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. Hopefully by now you've noticed that there's a pretty glaring omission. The category of Hispanic or Latino is asked in a separate question. According to the census, this is not a race, but an ethnicity. And on some level this makes sense. If you go to most Latin American countries, you will meet people just as racially diverse as here in the US. Though a little bit simplified, the analogy I like to use is that of cake. Bear with me on this. Cakes come in a lot of different flavors and types. There's vanilla, and chocolate, and carrot, and pound cake, and red velvet cake, and the list goes on and on and on. And some cakes are frosted, and some cakes are not frosted. According to the census, we might think of your race as akin to a type of cake, and one's ethnicity as Hispanic or Latino might be akin to whether or not the cake is frosted. Another interesting thing to note from these questions is that you're allowed to mark several boxes in the race question. This is relatively recent. Prior to the 2000 census, people were allowed to mark one and only one race. In fact, though race has been asked about in every census, the way the question was worded has changed almost every time. Consider the first census in 1790. This census reported on 5 categories of people in the country: white males age 16 and over, white males under the age of 16, white females regardless of age, all other free persons, and slaves. Not exactly how we think of the world today, is it? And changes are likely in store for the next census coming up in 2020. It's also worth noting that different places have different classifications. In the US, race is largely based on ancestry. Everyone in a family is racially linked. Note that these categories correspond to various regions of the world and where one's family, however many generations removed, likely originated. As such, everyone in a family based on blood ties is racially linked to one another. But consider Brazil, a country with just as much of a complicated history of colonization and immigration as in the US. In Brazil, race is determined primarily by appearance. They have 5 categories as well, but those categories are brancos, pardos, pretos, amarelos, and indígena. This means it's possible, and indeed relatively common, to have many different racially identified people within the same family. If you're feeling a bit confused, that is certainly understandable. Far from being the straightforward thing we often think it is, understanding race is incredibly complicated. This is because racial categories are socially constructed. Though we perceive a physical reality to race, our racial categories are not rooted in biology or genetics, but in the way we collectively make meaning about the world. But if you're tempted to say, well, let's just do away with race altogether, not so fast. Our categories of race are socially constructed, yes, but they've taken on a life of their own, and they have significant social and material realities connected to them. This is what we're going to be talking about soon. In our next class, we will focus on further unpacking what it means to say that race is a social construct and explore how we generate meaning on this topic. And then a few weeks from now, we'll take some time to explore some of the enduring racial inequalities in this country and consider what might be necessary in order to eliminate those inequalities. And that brings me to something I want you to look up for next time. Visit the Pew Research Center on Social and Demographic Trends, specifically a section called What the Census Calls Us. Here you can explore different census categories that we've seen across history, including that picture I showed you a bit before, throughout the different decades that we've had the census. And there's a few things I want you to look for while you're here. I want you to look up, when were Native Americans specifically tracked as a group? What census was that? And what was the label that was used in that first time? What were the classifications the census used for race in 1900? And how many more groups did the census ask about in 1930 relative to 1900? I know that's a good bit of information. Write it down in your notes, bring it with you for next class, and we're going to do some activities that will have us exploring this in a little bit more detail.